Sarah Thompson's hands gripped her leather handbag tightly as she walked through the metal detectors at the Franklin County Courthouse. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the marble floor. She had spent the previous night organizing her evidence: photographs, timestamps, and even a witness statement, all neatly arranged in a blue folder. Courtroom 302, the security guard directed her, barely looking up from his crossword puzzle. Sarah's heels clicked against the floor as she made her way down the long hallway. At 32, she had built a successful career as a travel blogger, sharing stories from over 50 countries with her million-plus followers. But today, she wasn't here to share travel tales. She was here to contest a $500 parking ticket that she knew was wrongfully issued. The wooden benches in courtroom 302 were already filling up with other defendants. Sarah smoothed her navy blazer and took a seat in the third row, maintaining her professional composure despite the butterflies in her stomach. The room smelled of old wood and nervous energy. "All rise." The bailiff's voice boomed through the courtroom. The Honorable Judge William Harrison presiding. Judge Harrison entered, his black robe flowing behind him. At 58, he carried himself with the confidence of someone who had spent decades behind the bench. His salt and pepper hair was neatly combed, and his wire-rimmed glasses sat perfectly straight on his nose. As he settled into his chair, his eyes scanned the room with what seemed like practiced indifference. The cases before Sarah's moved quickly. A young man with a speeding ticket, guilty. An elderly woman who ran a red light, guilty with a reduced fine. A middle-aged businessman with an expired registration, case dismissed with a warning. Sarah noticed how Judge Harrison's tone shifted slightly with each defendant, sometimes stern, sometimes almost paternal. Case number 247, Sarah Thompson, parking violation on Madison Avenue, the clerk announced. Sarah stood up, clutching her blue folder. As she approached the podium, she could feel Judge Harrison's gaze settling on her. His expression remained neutral, but something in his eyes made her stomach tighten. "Miss Thompson," Judge Harrison began, his voice carrying a hint of impatience, "you're contesting a parking violation from March 15th. The officer's report states your vehicle was parked in a loading zone for over 2 hours. Do you have anything to say in your defense?" Sarah opened her folder with steady hands. "Yes, Your Honor. I have evidence that proves I was not parked there for more than the allowed 30 minutes. I have time-stamped photos." "Ms. Thompson," Judge Harrison interrupted, "the officer's report clearly states—" "Your Honor, if I may," Sarah persisted politely, her voice clear and professional. "I have photographs showing my arrival and departure times, plus a statement from the shop owner who can confirm." Judge Harrison's fingers drummed against his desk. "The officer's report is quite detailed, Miss Thompson. Are you suggesting the officer was mistaken?" The courtroom had grown quieter. Sarah could feel other defendants watching the exchange. She took a deep breath, remembering the breathing techniques she'd learned during her yoga retreats in Bali. "I'm not suggesting anything, Your Honor. I'm simply presenting evidence that shows I followed the parking regulations. As a regular visitor to that area, I'm well aware of the rules and always follow them carefully." Judge Harrison barely glanced at the photos Sarah held up. His expression had hardened, and he shuffled some papers on his desk with deliberate slowness. "Miss Thompson, this court relies on the sworn testimony of its officers. Your photos could have been taken on any day. The fine stands at $500. Next case." Sarah stood there for a moment, stunned. She had faced challenging situations in her travels, from lost passports in Bangkok to sandstorms in Dubai, but this dismissal felt different. It wasn't just about the money. It was about being heard, about being treated fairly. As she gathered her documents, Sarah noticed the subtle head shakes of sympathy from some observers in the courtroom. The businesswoman who had been let off with a warning gave her a knowing look. Walking back to her car, Sarah's mind was already composing a blog post, not about exotic destinations this time, but about justice, bias, and the importance of speaking up. Little did she know, this encounter would soon lead to changes neither she nor Judge Harrison could have anticipated. The parking ticket sat in her bag like a weight, but Sarah Thompson had learned through her travels that sometimes the most meaningful journeys start with an unexpected detour. This was just the beginning of a story that would reach far beyond the walls of courtroom 302. That evening, Sarah sat in her modern downtown apartment, staring at the $500 fine notice on her desk. The city lights twinkled outside her window, but her usual appreciation for the view was overshadowed by the morning's events. Her laptop screen glowed with an open draft titled Justice, Not Always Blind. Her phone buzzed with a notification, another booking request for her upcoming travel workshop in Singapore. Usually, these messages brought excitement, but tonight, her mind kept replaying Judge Harrison's dismissive tone in the courtroom. "This isn't right," she muttered, picking up her phone and scrolling through the photos from the parking incident. The timestamps were clear: 2:15 p.m. arrival, 2:42 p.m. departure. Less than 30 minutes, just as she had tried to explain to the judge. Sarah opened her travel blog's admin panel. With over 1 million followers across social media platforms, she had built a reputation for honest, thoughtful commentary on her experiences around the world. Her posts about cultural differences and social justice had always resonated with her readers. This would be different. This was personal. As she began typing her story, her phone rang. It was Maya, her best friend and fellow blogger. "Girl, you won't believe what's happening." Maya's voice came through the speaker. "Someone from the courthouse posted about your hearing on Twitter. It's getting attention." Sarah quickly opened Twitter and found the thread. A law student who had been in the courtroom had described the entire scene, highlighting the contrast between her treatment and that of other defendants. The thread already had thousands of retweets. "A Travel with Sarah was treated so unfairly in court today," read one comment. "Same judge dismissed 3 similar cases with white defendants. #courtroom bias." Sarah's stomach tightened. She hadn't planned on this becoming a social media story, but here it was, unfolding in real time. Her inbox started filling with messages from followers sharing their own courthouse experiences. Meanwhile, across town, Judge William Harrison was having dinner with his wife, Patricia, in their colonial-style home. The evening news played quietly in the background until a familiar name caught his attention. The hashtag courtroom bias is trending locally, the news anchor reported, following allegations of discriminatory treatment in Judge William Harrison's courtroom. The case involves popular travel blogger Sarah Thompson. Patricia looked at her husband over her reading glasses. "William, isn't that the parking violation case you mentioned earlier?" Judge Harrison set down his fork, his appetite suddenly gone. In his 30 years on the bench, he had prided himself on being fair and impartial. But as the news segment continued, showing clips from Sarah's previous speaking engagements at diversity conferences and her TEDx talk about breaking cultural barriers, he felt an unfamiliar discomfort. I didn't know who she was," he said quietly, more to himself than to Patricia. "That's not the point, dear," Patricia replied gently. "Did you really look at her evidence?" The question hung in the air. Judge Harrison remembered the blue folder, the photos he had barely glanced at, the confident yet respectful way Sarah had tried to present her case. Had he been too quick to dismiss her? Back in her apartment, Sarah finished writing her blog post. It wasn't angry or accusatory. Instead, it was a thoughtful reflection on implicit bias and the importance of equal treatment under the law. She included statistics about racial disparities in traffic stops and court rulings, putting her experience into a broader context. Just before hitting publish, she added a final paragraph. "This isn't about one judge or one fine. It's about the countless others who face similar treatment every day without the platform to speak up. Change starts with awareness, and awareness starts with conversation." The post went live at 9:47 p.m. Within minutes, comments began pouring in. Legal professionals, social justice advocates, and regular readers all engaged with her story. Several local news outlets requested interviews. Sarah closed her laptop and walked to her window, watching the city below. Tomorrow, she would pay the fine. She could afford it after all. But this story was bigger than $500 now. It was about making sure the next person who stood in courtroom 302 would be heard, regardless of their appearance or social status. As the night grew later, both Sarah and Judge Harrison lay awake in their respective homes, unaware that their paths would soon cross again under very different circumstances. The wheels of change had been set in motion, and there was no turning back. The next morning, Jessica Chen, Judge Harrison's clerk of 5 years, arrived early at the courthouse with her usual cup of green tea. As she organized the day's cases, she scrolled through her social media feed. Suddenly, she nearly spilled her tea when she recognized Sarah Thompson's story trending locally. "Oh my goodness," Jessica whispered, quickly clicking through Sarah's blog. The stunning travel photographs and thoughtful cultural commentary caught her attention. There was Sarah standing before the Taj Mahal, teaching English to children in Vietnam and giving a keynote speech at the United Nations about cultural exchange. When Judge Harrison arrived at 8:30 a.m., looking more tired than usual, Jessica took a deep breath. She had always appreciated his fairness in the past, which made yesterday's events even more surprising. "Your Honor," she began carefully, "I think there's something you should see." Judge Harrison looked up from his morning coffee. "What is it, Jessica?" "It's about yesterday's parking violation case. The defendant, Sarah Thompson, she's actually quite well known." Jessica turned her computer screen toward him. "She's a respected travel blogger who speaks at international conferences about cultural understanding. Her latest post about yesterday's hearing is getting a lot of attention." Judge Harrison sat down heavily in his chair, his coffee forgotten. For the next 20 minutes, he scrolled through Sarah's blog, reading her articles about breaking down cultural barriers and promoting understanding across communities. Her post about the court hearing was diplomatic and measured, focusing on systemic issues rather than personal attacks. "She even has a law degree from Georgetown," Jessica added quietly, though she chose to pursue travel journalism instead. The weight of his hasty judgment from yesterday pressed harder on Judge Harrison's conscience. He clicked on a video of Sarah speaking at a youth leadership conference. Her words echoed in his office. "The most dangerous biases are the ones we don't recognize in ourselves." Meanwhile, across town, Sarah was dealing with an explosion of media attention. Her phone hadn't stopped ringing since dawn. Local news stations wanted interviews, civil rights organizations offered support, and her blog post had gone viral internationally. "I never meant for this to become so big," Sarah explained to Maya over breakfast at their favorite cafe. "I just wanted to share my experience." "But that's exactly why it's important," Maya replied, stirring her coffee. "Your platform means people are finally listening to a story that happens every day." Sarah's phone buzzed again, this time with an email from a producer at National Public Radio. They wanted to feature her story in a segment about bias in the justice system. Back at the courthouse, Judge Harrison canceled his lunch plans. He spent the hour reviewing the body cam footage from the parking incident. The evidence was clear. Sarah had indeed only been parked for 27 minutes. The officer's report had confused her black SUV with another similar vehicle that had been there earlier. "Jessica," he called to his clerk, "can you pull all my rulings on parking violations from the past 6 months?" The data painted an uncomfortable picture. When Jessica compiled the statistics, they showed a clear pattern. Defendants of color consistently received higher fines and fewer dismissals than white defendants in similar situations. Judge Harrison removed his glasses and rubbed his temples. In 30 years on the bench, he had always considered himself colorblind in his rulings. The numbers told a different story. "Cancel my afternoon appointments," he instructed Jessica. "And see if you can find out who represents Ms. Thompson." As the afternoon sun cast long shadows through his office windows, Judge Harrison began drafting a letter. Not just a simple apology, that wouldn't be enough. This would be a formal acknowledgement of the need for change, starting with his own courtroom. Sarah, meanwhile, sat in her home office, preparing for the NPR interview. Her phone pinged with a message from an unknown number. "Ms. Thompson, I represent Judge Harrison. You would like to arrange a meeting to discuss yesterday's events and explore possibilities for positive change." She stared at the message for a long moment. This wasn't about winning or losing anymore. It wasn't even about the fine. This was an opportunity to turn a negative experience into something meaningful. As the day drew to a close, both Sarah and Judge Harrison found themselves at turning points in their lives, neither aware that their next meeting would spark changes throughout the entire judicial district. Sometimes, the most important journeys begin with a single misstep. Judge Harrison sat in his study at 2 a.m., surrounded by law books and case files. His wife Patricia had long since gone to bed, but sleep eluded him. The soft glow of his desk lamp illuminated dozens of sticky notes covered in his handwriting, statistics, dates, and patterns he couldn't ignore anymore. He clicked through Sarah's travel blog again, pausing at a photo of her helping build a school in Guatemala. The caption read, Change begins when we step outside our comfort zone and see the world through different eyes. The words hit closer to home than he expected. Taking off his reading glasses, he pulled up the courthouse security footage from the day of Sarah's hearing. He watched himself on the screen, noting his body language, the way he barely looked at her evidence, how quickly he dismissed her explanations. The same footage showed him spending several minutes reviewing photos from a white defendant in a similar case just hours earlier. "William?" Patricia's voice came softly from the doorway. She stood there in her robe, concern etched on her face. "You've been up every night this week." "I've been going through all my cases from the past year," he replied, his voice heavy. "The patterns, they're undeniable, Patricia. I've been part of the problem without even realizing it." Patricia walked over and placed a hand on his shoulder, looking at the scattered papers on his desk. "What are you going to do about it?" Before he could answer, his phone buzzed. It was a text from Jessica, his clerk. "Judge, you should see this." Sarah Thompson just posted a new blog entry about systematic change and the importance of self-reflection in the justice system. Opening the link, he found Sarah's latest post titled "Beyond the Courtroom, a Call for Collective Growth." She wrote about the overwhelming response to her story and her hope that it would lead to meaningful dialogue rather than division. Meanwhile, across town, Sarah sat cross-legged on her balcony, watching the city lights flicker. Her laptop showed dozens of open tabs, statistics on judicial bias, stories from others who had similar experiences, and resources on court reform initiatives from other states. Her phone rang. It was Dr. Martinez from the State Judicial Review Board. "Ms. Thompson," Dr. Martinez began, "we've been following your story with great interest. Would you be willing to speak at our upcoming judicial conference about your experience?" Sarah's heart raced. This was bigger than her parking ticket now. What exactly would this involve, she asked. "We want to create a dialogue about unconscious bias in our courts," Dr. Martinez explained. "Your story has opened up an important conversation. We'd like you to share your perspective with judges from across the state." Back in his study, Judge Harrison finally made a decision. He opened his email and began typing. "Dear Ms. Thompson, I've spent the past week reviewing not just your case, but my entire approach to justice. Your blog post wasn't just about a parking ticket. It was a mirror that forced me to confront uncomfortable truths about my own biases. I'm requesting a formal review of my past rulings and have enrolled in an intensive judicial bias training program. But more importantly, I would like to meet with you, not as a judge, but as someone who wants to learn and do better. Sincerely, William Harrison." As he hit send, his hand shaking slightly, Jessica sent another text. "Judge, you've been nominated for the Judicial Reform Committee." They specifically mentioned the need for judges to show willingness to acknowledge and address their biases. The night grew quieter as both Sarah and Judge Harrison contemplated the changes taking shape. Sarah's phone lit up with the judge's email. Reading it, she felt a mix of emotions: surprise, hope, and a sense of responsibility. She began drafting her response, careful to maintain the professional yet open tone that had characterized her blog posts. "Dear Judge Harrison, thank you for your email. I believe that real change starts with honest conversations." As the first hints of dawn appeared on the horizon, both Sarah and Judge Harrison had taken crucial steps toward transformation, him by confronting his biases, her by choosing engagement over anger. Neither knew that their upcoming meeting would become a catalyst for changes throughout the entire state judicial system. The parking ticket that had started it all still sat on Sarah's desk, but it had become something more, a symbol of how small moments of injustice, when addressed with courage and honesty, could lead to meaningful change. The morning sun streamed through the windows of the local news station as Sarah adjusted her microphone. She was about to go live on Morning Metro, the city's most watched breakfast show. Her blog post had sparked a movement that went far beyond her expectations. 3 minutes until we're live, the producer called out. Across from Sarah sat Helen Martinez, a veteran news anchor known for her tough questions. "So, Ms. Thompson," Helen began as the cameras started rolling, "your experience in Judge Harrison's courtroom has gained national attention. Did you expect this level of response?" Sarah straightened in her chair. "Not at all. What started as a simple parking ticket has revealed a deeper conversation our community needed to have. My inbox is filled with hundreds of similar stories from people who felt voiceless in our justice system. Meanwhile, in his office, Judge Harrison watched the interview on his computer. Jessica had brought him his usual morning coffee, but it sat untouched as he listened to Sarah speak. Her words were measured, focusing on solutions rather than blame. The statistics are troubling. Sarah continued on screen. In our county alone, minorities receive 60% higher fines for the same violations. This isn't about one judge or one case, it's about a system that needs rebuilding. Judge Harrison's phone buzzed with texts from his colleagues. Some were supportive, others defensive. The Chief Justice had called an emergency meeting for that afternoon to discuss the growing media attention. Across social media, #courtroom equality was trending. Sarah's followers had grown by hundreds of thousands, not for her travel content. People were sharing their own courthouse experiences, creating a digital tapestry of stories that couldn't be ignored. In the courthouse break room, clerks and attorneys huddled around the television. "She's handling this with such grace," one public defender remarked. "No angry accusations, just facts and a call for change." After the interview, Sarah checked her messages. The ACLU wanted to collaborate on a judicial reform initiative. 3 major universities had invited her to speak about social justice, but one email stood out, a message from Judge Harrison's wife, Patricia. "Dear Ms. Thompson," it read, "I want you to know that your words have deeply affected my husband. In 30 years of marriage, I've never seen him so committed to personal growth. Would you consider meeting us for dinner? Not for publicity, but for a real conversation." Sarah showed the email to Maya over lunch. "What do you think? Is it too soon?" Maya stirred her soup thoughtfully. "Your blog post was about opening dialogues, right? Maybe this is where it starts." Back at the courthouse, the emergency meeting was in full swing. Judge Harrison sat quietly as his colleagues debated the situation. Some wanted to release a statement defending their practices. Others suggested forming a community advisory board. The numbers don't lie. Judge Harrison finally spoke up. "I've reviewed my own rulings. The bias was there, even if I didn't see it. We need to do more than damage control. We need real change." The room fell silent. Judge Harrison had been one of their most respected members for decades. His words carried weight. In her apartment that evening, Sarah crafted her reply to Patricia's email. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard as she considered the implications. A notification popped up. Another news outlet wanted an interview. "Dear Mrs. Harrison," she typed, "thank you for reaching out. I believe that real understanding starts with face-to-face conversations. I would be honored to meet with you and Judge Harrison." As she hit send, her phone rang. It was Dr. Martinez from the Judicial Review Board again. "Ms. Thompson, we drafted new guidelines for judicial bias training, inspired by your case. Would you be willing to review them?" The sun was setting over the city as Sarah walked to her favorite thinking spot in the park. Children played on the swings, parents chatted on benches, and for a moment, she saw the world she was fighting for, one where justice truly was blind. Her phone buzzed with Patricia's quick reply. "Thank you, Sarah. This means more than you know. William has suggested a small family-owned restaurant where we can talk privately. Would this Saturday work?" As Sarah marked her calendar, she realized that change wasn't always about grand gestures or viral posts. Sometimes, it started with a simple dinner conversation between people willing to listen and learn from each other. The story had moved beyond trending hashtags and news interviews. It was becoming something more meaningful, a catalyst for real transformation in their community's justice system. And it all began with a parking ticket that refused to be ignored. The small Italian restaurant was quiet on Saturday evening, tucked away in a corner of the city that tourists rarely found. Sarah arrived early, choosing a private booth at the back. The red and white checkered tablecloth and flickering candle created a warm atmosphere, but her hands were cold with nervousness. At exactly 7 o'clock, Judge Harrison and Patricia walked in. Without his black robes and in a casual sweater, the judge looked different, more human somehow. Patricia's kind smile helped ease the tension as they settled into their seats. "Thank you for coming," Patricia began, breaking the awkward silence. "We ordered their homemade garlic bread. It's the best in the city." Judge Harrison cleared his throat. In the soft restaurant lighting, the dark circles under his eyes were visible. "Ms. Thompson, Sarah, I want to start by saying something I should have said in the courtroom. I was wrong. Sarah watched as he pulled out a folder, similar to the blue one she had tried to show him that day in court. I'd spent the past week reviewing every parking violation case I handled in the last year. The pattern is clear, and it's unacceptable. As the waiter brought their garlic bread, Judge Harrison shared his findings. Cases involving minorities received fines averaging 45% higher. White defendants were 3 times more likely to have their cases dismissed. The numbers painted a picture he couldn't ignore anymore. But you're doing something about it now, Sarah said softly, surprised by the emotion in her own voice. That's what matters. Patricia reached for her husband's hand. William hasn't slept properly since that day. He's been making calls, reviewing cases, enrolling in training programs. The conversation flowed easier as their meals arrived. Sarah shared stories from her travels, teaching moments when her own prejudices were challenged. Judge Harrison talked about his early days as a lawyer when he believed justice was simple and clear-cut. I'm presenting my findings to the Judicial Review Board next week, he explained, twirling pasta on his fork. But I want to do more. We need systematic changes, not just personal ones. Sarah's eyes lit up. Actually, I've been working on something. The ACLU helped me draft a proposal for a community oversight committee. Would you be willing to look at it? As they shared a tiramisu dessert, the 3 of them began sketching ideas on napkins. Patricia, a former teacher, suggested educational programs for law students. Judge Harrison thought about mentorship opportunities for minority law clerks. Sarah contributed ideas about transparency in the courtroom. In the next booth, someone recognized Sarah from her viral blog post. Soon, whispers spread through the restaurant. But for once, Sarah didn't mind the attention. This wasn't about social media anymore. It was about real people making real changes. There's something else, Judge Harrison said as they finished their coffee. The Chief Justice is creating a task force on judicial reform. They'd asked me to lead it, but I think we need more voices at the table. Would you consider joining as a community representative? Sarah was stunned. This was bigger than anything she had imagined when she walked into traffic court that day. I would be honored, she replied. As they stood to leave, the restaurant owner approached their table. An elderly Italian man with kind eyes, he had tears in his face. I heard your conversation, he admitted. 20 years ago, my son faced a judge who wouldn't listen. Today, you give me hope. Outside, the city lights twinkled under a clear night sky. Patricia hugged Sarah goodbye, whispering, "Thank you for giving us this chance." Judge Harrison shook her hand, the gesture formal, but his eyes showing genuine respect. As Sarah walked to her car, she received a notification. Her latest blog post about the power of second chances had just gone live. But tonight, she didn't check the view count or comments. The real change was happening here, in quiet conversations and honest admissions. The parking ticket that started it all was still pinned to her bulletin board at home. She planned to frame it someday, not as a reminder of injustice, but as proof that change was possible when people were brave enough to acknowledge their mistakes and do better. On Monday, Judge Harrison would return to his courtroom, and Sarah would continue planning her next travel adventure. But something had shifted. They had moved beyond viral stories and trending hashtags to the real work of making justice truly blind. The conference hall at the State Judicial Center buzzed with anticipation. Hundreds of judges, attorneys, and legal professionals filled the rows of seats. At the podium, Sarah adjusted the microphone, her heart racing as she looked at her notes one last time. Judge Harrison sat in the front row, a proud smile on his face. In the 3 months since their dinner at the Italian restaurant, they had become unlikely allies in the fight for judicial reform. Today was the culmination of their efforts, the first Judicial Bias Awareness Conference in the state's history. When I walked into traffic court that day, Sarah began, her voice steady, I was just another face in the crowd. Today, I stand before you not as an adversary, but as a partner in progress. The audience listened intently as she shared statistics, stories, and solutions. Gone was the anger from her viral blog post, replaced by measured wisdom and hope. In the back of the room, news cameras rolled quietly. This wasn't just local news anymore. Judge Harrison took the stage next, his usual stern demeanor softened by humility. My colleagues, he addressed the crowd, we cannot judge others until we judge ourselves. My experience with Ms. Thompson opened my eyes to biases I never knew I carried. He clicked to the first slide of their presentation, the Franklin County Initiative. It was an ambitious program they had developed together: mandatory bias training, community oversight boards, and transparent reporting of judicial decisions. In the audience, Jessica, Judge Harrison's clerk, wiped away tears. She remembered the morning she had shown him Sarah's blog, never imagining it would lead to this moment. Now, she was part of the team implementing these changes. During the lunch break, Sarah found herself surrounded by judges from across the state, each sharing their own moments of realization. One elderly judge admitted he had dismissed similar cases without proper consideration. Another asked about starting a similar program in her district. The most powerful thing, Sarah told them, is that Judge Harrison didn't just apologize. He took action. That's what we need from all of you. Patricia Harrison worked the room too, distributing copies of their new judicial training manual. She had contributed a chapter on the importance of family support in times of personal growth and change. Back at the podium, Judge Harrison revealed the results of their pilot program. In just 3 months, the racial disparity in traffic court rulings had decreased by 40%. Community trust scores were up. Other counties were requesting guidance on implementing similar reforms. But numbers aren't everything, he said, gesturing to Sarah to join him on stage. This is about human dignity, about seeing each person who stands before us as worthy of our full attention and respect. Together, they announced the launch of a statewide mentorship program, pairing experienced judges with community advocates. The goal was to build bridges between the judiciary and the communities they served. After the conference, Sarah and the Harrisons gathered in his chambers. The walls, once covered in legal certificates, now displayed charts tracking their progress and thank you letters from community members. "I never thought I'd say this," Sarah smiled. "That parking ticket might have been the best thing that happened to our city's justice system." Judge Harrison chuckled, a sound that would have seemed impossible months ago. "Next week, we present to the state Supreme Court. They're considering making our program mandatory statewide." Patricia brought out a small cake she had hidden in her bag. To celebrate 3 months of change, she explained, cutting slices for everyone. As they enjoyed their impromptu celebration, Sarah's phone buzzed with notifications. The conference hashtag was trending nationally. Legal blogs were already calling it a revolutionary approach to judicial reform. But more meaningful were the messages from ordinary people. "Watched her speech online. Finally feel heard. My daughter wants to be a judge now. Thank you for showing her it's possible to change the system." Outside, the sun was setting over the courthouse steps where Sarah had once stood feeling powerless. Now, those same steps were filled with conference attendees discussing implementation plans for their own districts. Judge Harrison walked Sarah to her car, both tired but satisfied. "You know," he said, "when Jessica showed me your blog that morning, I thought my career was over. Instead, it was just beginning." Sarah smiled, remembering the nervous woman who had clutched a blue folder of evidence months ago. "Sometimes," she replied, "the best journeys start with a wrong turn." As she drove home, Sarah passed the spot where she had gotten that fateful parking ticket. The sign there now had a new addition: "Enforced with equality and justice for all." 1 year later, courtroom 302 looked very different. The wooden benches were the same, but new screens displayed real-time statistics about case outcomes and demographics. A diverse group of law students sat in the observer section, taking notes on the innovative proceedings they witnessed. Judge Harrison sat at his bench, but his demeanor had transformed. He listened carefully to each case, asking thoughtful questions and reviewing all evidence thoroughly. The rushing of previous years was gone, replaced by careful consideration. Sarah sat in the back row, smiling as she watched a young black woman present her case. The woman held a folder similar to the one Sarah had brought that fateful day. But this time, Judge Harrison leaned forward, engaged and attentive. "Motion granted," he announced, his voice clear and kind. "Thank you for your detailed evidence presentation." During the lunch break, Sarah joined Judge Harrison and Patricia in his chambers. The room had become a sort of unofficial museum of their journey. Framed newspaper articles covered one wall. "Local court becomes national model for judicial reform." "Judge and blogger partner for justice. State adopts Franklin County bias prevention program." Can you believe it's been a year? Patricia asked, unpacking their now traditional lunch from the Italian restaurant where everything had changed. Sarah shook her head, looking at her original parking ticket, now framed and hanging prominently on the wall. 27 states have adopted our program, she said proudly. The federal courts are considering it too. Judge Harrison checked his email on his phone. The National Judicial Conference wants us to keynote next month, he announced. They're calling our story the Franklin Revolution. The statistics spoke for themselves. Bias complaints had dropped by 85%. Community trust in the court system had soared. Other judges now visited regularly to learn from their example. Remember when we thought this was just about a parking ticket? Sarah laughed, sharing garlic bread with Patricia. A knock at the door interrupted their lunch. Jessica, now the head of their judicial reform implementation team, entered with excitement. The president just signed the Judicial Fairness Act, she announced. They're calling it the Thompson-Harrison Bill. The law would require all federal courts to implement bias training and transparency measures similar to their program. Sarah's blog about that first day in court was even quoted in the Congressional Record. Later that afternoon, Sarah stood in front of a new class of judicial clerks. Teaching had become another unexpected part of her journey. Her travel blog now balanced stories of global adventures with insights about justice and change. Change doesn't always come from grand gestures, she told the attentive students. Sometimes it starts with a parking ticket and a judge brave enough to admit he was wrong. In the evening, the courthouse steps hosted a community celebration. Food trucks lined the street, including one from their favorite Italian restaurant. Children played on the lawn while their parents chatted with judges and court staff. Judge Harrison took the microphone, looking out at the diverse crowd. 1 year ago, this courthouse was a symbol of division, he said. Today, it's a beacon of hope. Sarah watched from the side, remembering how different things had been. Her phone buzzed, another court system requesting their help with implementation. These days, she split her time between travel blogging and judicial reform consulting. As the sun set, Sarah, Judge Harrison, and Patricia stood together, watching the community they had helped transform. Children played tag between the food trucks, lawyers chatted with community activists, and the courthouse seemed to glow with new purpose. What's next? Patricia asked, passing out ice cream cones from a nearby truck. Sarah smiled, pulling out her tablet. 5 more states want to start the program, she said. And I'm thinking of writing a book, From Parking Tickets to Progress, a story of change. Judge Harrison nodded, looking at the courthouse he worked in for 3 decades. You know what the best part is? He said quietly. Every morning, I look forward to coming to work, to doing better than the day before. As the celebration continued around them, Sarah thought about all the lives touched by their story, not just in their city, but across the country. What had started as a moment of injustice had grown into a movement for change. The parking ticket that had brought them together was just a distant memory now, but its impact would be felt for generations to come. Sometimes, Sarah realized, the biggest changes start with the smallest moments, when people choose to listen, learn, and grow together.